Hello, I'm John Grom, and welcome to our 95th Right and Left Discussion Forum. We hold our discussion panels twice monthly to demonstrate the value of civil, productive, open-minded discussion. Today, our panel will discuss a topic that has generated a lot of heat in the past few weeks. Not only is the major media's objectivity being challenged, but the role of the press in general in the functioning of a free, self-governed society. Self-governed society, I can say that. Our panel today, beginning on my left, is Patty Haskins, retired math teacher and member of the Wadsworth City Council. On her left is Bryan Laubaugh, president of R&B Financial Services. On his left is Jerry Ritzman, founding partner of Ritzman Pharmacies. And today we kind of wish a get well to Ron Chamberlin, who is home recovering from a hip replacement. He thought he was going to be able to make it today, but not. Get well, Ron. Patty, as long as there have been politicians and journalists, there's been an uneasy relationship between them. In 2017, more of the same. Is 2017 more of the same, or are we looking at something different?
Well, I think it's been ramped up in the 2017 cycle because of more attention being given to the media and bias and so forth. You know, media bias is not something that has just started, as you said. I mean, in the late 1700s, you know, originally, I know Benjamin Franklin had produced an article requesting that more currency be printed. And he did this because he had a printing shop and he wanted to be able to make more money on it. So there was obviously bias in the article that he printed in a periodical, which he used a pen name for it. He did not use his own name, but you know, that's gone on for years. Many of the major newspapers in the country, when they originally were started very blatantly as a representative of a particular party. That's why there's still many newspapers that have the word Democratic in their name, because they were started for the Democrat Party, and the same thing with the Republicans. I think with the major news outlets today, all of them, I think, do have a certain bias or a certain bent.
But they claim objectivity.
Well, and some claim more objectivity than others. I mean, we have one that claims they're fair and balanced, and all you have to do is watch them for 5 minutes and you know where they stand. So, you know, to make that claim and that hype is not really accurate, I don't think. What's happened with this campaign, starting with the presidential campaign, we started with what would be called fake news. And fake news, when it originally came out, was truly that. It was fake news published by these unknown bloggers and on internet sites that produced stories that were totally outlandish, which some people tended to believe. For example, the news that Hillary Clinton was running some type of child abduction ring out of a pizza shop in North Carolina. And then someone reacted to that story. And that's where the term fake news is. Donald Trump, however, has appropriated that term fake news and applied it to all media, and especially anybody that says anything that is not glowing and praising of him. If you disagree with them, then it automatically becomes fake news, whether it is or not. There has also been terrible bashing of the mainstream media when you have Donald Trump standing at rallies and pointing to the media and telling everyone at your rally to turn around, look at those people, they're liars, every one of them. And so that we have people now that believe what he says, and then we have people that believe what the media says, and the truth is probably somewhere in between. I find it very difficult with the president today because he himself is, in my mind, one of the biggest purveyors of fake news and lies without substantiation of anyone that I know, but then has the audacity to claim that every news outlet that reports what he says and reports that, no, there weren't 3 to 5 million people that voted illegally. No, that you didn't have 1.8 million people. No, Obama was not born in Kenya. And no.
And no, he did not go to 57 states and only has 2 more to go.
Yeah, so, the person that seems to be putting out the most fake news would be him. But it's because of that heightened awareness, and I think the media, very honestly, having a little bit of a thin skin about the whole thing.
Obviously, I know where you're coming from politically.
Yes.
That's why we love you. But one person's fake news is somebody else's truth. In driving here this morning, I was listening to NPR, which I normally do, and they talked about the latest travel ban out of the White House, and they referred to the travel ban on Muslim-majority countries. Now, there's a big difference between saying Muslim-majority countries and high terrorist risk countries, which is what the ban is all about. It just so happens that there are a majority. But you see, somebody who is really sensitive might think that's fake news because those countries being majority Muslim had nothing to do with the travel ban.
Possibly. If you look at some of the reasoning for that, I might disagree with that, but that's an ideological difference of opinion. I don't know that that is an outright lie. Those countries are Muslim majority countries.
Yes, they are.
So it is not a lie to state that. It's your interpretation. One of the things I found is that they say that the best way to get an honest discussion about an issue is allow people to speak their ideology, but do it together in a forum like this, where we're not shouting down one another, where some of the news stations they'll bring in one token conservative or one token liberal, and everybody screams at that person and shouts them down.
That's what fair and balanced is about. You get people on the 2 extremes to scream at each other. That's balance.
And I see screamers on all the networks. I mean, Chris Matthews, Sean Hannity, Bill O'Reilly, Fox and Friends. You can go down the list and find those that scream. And in that case, you're not discussing that ideology. You're not getting all of the information presented to you. But, like you said, what one man thinks is bias is another man's truth.
Yeah.
So,
Bryan, where are you coming down on all of this? I have an idea you're slightly different than Patty.
Yeah, well, I agree with Patty. I think the mess that the mainstream media has created is a mess that they need to start cleaning up, because a lot of the stuff that you see, and it's the way they cast the news, and you gave a very good example of how they cast a particular issue to make it seem like it's against a Muslim country. Now, if we expelled the Chinese diplomats for spying and hacking our system, you wouldn't say that we just expelled everyone that believed in Buddha. They were Chinese, and because their religious affiliation had nothing to do with it. But because Mr. Trump, and I'll say it again, I'm really not a supporter of his, but the hypocrisy is mind-bending when you look at, and you see how the media is twisting everything that comes out of the White House now, whereas before it was okay. I go back to the 7 countries in the original executive order. They were the same countries that the previous administration had on a terror watch list. There wasn't nary a peep that came out of the mainstream media about Muslim countries, whatever. They go back and they start taking out different facts. They're now touting that the Obama administration deported 2.5 million people. And the Trump administration's only going to do 1.5. Well, where was that in the news? So the issue that I have is, my feeling is that the mainstream media, and you throw them all together, they have spent all of their capital, as far as I'm concerned. They're creating news. They're probably one of the larger problems because they have the megaphone. The scope of news nowadays goes around the world in a heartbeat. Something goes viral. The story that you point to, the first story, one of the first stories about the new administration was a CNN reporter who reported that the Martin Luther King bust was taken out of the Oval Office. That was wrong.
And he retracted that immediately.
After a day and a half.
He didn't double down on it for a week
Right,
afterwards.
but the fact is
Okay.
but you can't unring a bell. That went around, and all of a sudden we've got a racist in the office. And if you looked at Twitter and you looked at all these other things, they ran with that story until someone called the guy and said, hey, wait a second, the bust is still there. So this happens. It's happening with more frequency, and I think that they're not doing themselves any favors. I don't agree with vilifying them. I'm not in that camp as far as some of the things that Mr. Trump, President Trump, has said about the media. But it's unfortunate that they find themselves in this when they're supposed to be that fourth estate. They're supposed to have those special privileges. They're supposed to be able to call people out. When you read anything about President Johnson, I mean, he had just utter disdain for Walter Cronkite because Walter Cronkite and the news started a daily death tally.
Yes.
Right.
If you remember that,
Yeah,
and I was
I
a
do.
little guy, but when you start reading about it, and he wanted to jerk, Walter Cronkite in the Oval Office and tell him that he was he was just anti-American, un-American, and look what you're doing. So if it's good for the goose, it has to be good for the gander. Unfortunately, we've had 8 years of nothing, and now they're waking up to the monster that they've created. And they're beside themselves. They're like, well, how did this happen? Well, for 8 years you said and did nothing, and I could point to 5 or 6 instances where they just sat there on their hands and went with the narrative. It's amazing to me, and I'll end with this, when a particular organization, this was a New York Times reporter, the New York Times, the bastion of truth and getting to the bottom of things. He was sending, and we know this because WikiLeaks hacked Podesta and got this information, maybe not WikiLeaks, but somebody hacked him. He was submitting stories that he was going to publish in the New York Times as an objective reporter, or so-called objective reporter, asking them what they felt and what could he change, because he didn't want to mess up the narrative. That, to me, that's an automatic disqualification. I can't think anybody would read this guy, and he was one of the ones that they asked not to participate. That was the gentleman from the New York Times that the Trump administration said, we're sorry, but we're not going to allow you into the pool for that. And it's the same thing that...
You mean in the White House press conference?
In the White House press conference. And it's the same thing that Mr. Obama did to the gentleman from Fox News, And it's their hair's on fire because of different things about the NSA and all that stuff. Everybody forgets that Mr. Obama went after the AP. Mm-hmm. Where was all that reporting?
Yeah.
So all of a sudden we had this very quiet, compliant press, and now all of a sudden their hair's on fire because how did this happen? And you can't do this. It's like it went on for 8 years. Mm-hmm. Where were they then?
Yeah.
I don't know that it was that compliant. By the way, I find it ironic that you just cite WikiLeaks, and Donald Trump loved WikiLeaks last summer, and what has been the news the last 3 days, and now they're the worst things since sliced, going. So
yeah,
interesting.
Exactly.
It's all
Jerry,
point of view.
What are your thoughts, Jerry?
Well, I think that this is encouraging what's going on in the press and with the media. The only thing that I would take issue with is that they purport to be unbiased. Mm-hmm. If they want to present the conservative or the liberal or whatever point of view, that's fine. If they want to interpret the news that way, that's great. But don't tell me that this is, an unvarnished opinion that you're giving me. Come right out and say it. This is our interpretation of it. I think that as far as the civility between politicians in the press and so forth, it's probably not much different than it's been for the last couple hundred years. It's probably even more civil. With some of the pointed references to people's heritage and that type of thing, and I wonder what's happening in the media. Let's make a parallel to purchasing directly from the manufacturer, and the internet has given us that ability to go to somebody's website and purchase an item directly from the manufacturer and pass, you know, the wholesaler and the retailer, and so it's coming direct to us from the guy that made it. That's what's happening in the news. The news is coming direct to us from the person who is making it, and it's bypassing the press because of our Twitter and other things like that. It's coming direct to us. In the press, they probably don't like that because they're getting cut out of the cycle. And I think a lot of times, somebody once said, when you're getting close to the target is when you start catching flack. And so I wonder what's going on there. They've lost control.
There was a woman on MSNBC that I saw talking about Trump going directly to the voters, trying to shape their opinion. She said, that's our job. Anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I wanted to reinforce what you were.
But and I remember reading, when I was in junior high and high school and so forth, started reading the editorial page in the Beacon Journal, and Ben Maidenberg was the editor, and being attracted to that type of thing, not really knowing what his political or philosophies were, but I think that if we know that, and now we know if we look at a columnist who's writing a particular column, we probably know what viewpoint they're going to put on an event or a trend, and then sometimes you look at the name and you refuse to read it because it's going to oppose your particular.
Well,
and that's a personal responsibility that I have to.
But you know
overcome.
that because of the history of the person, not because they've already acknowledged the fact
that's
that
correct.
They've come down one way or another.
That's correct.
I had to look something up yesterday because I had this memory of when I first moved to Wadsworth back in the early '60s, and looked at the Wadsworth news banner, and down in a corner, I think on the last page, where it gives the name of the editor and the publisher and all that, and it said it was a Republican newspaper. And I thought, did it really say that? So I looked up the history of the banner, and by gosh, it did. It described itself as being a Republican newspaper. So you shouldn't be surprised.
Right. When John Miller's editorials were pro-Republican.
Very much so.
The question I have, though, is that we know that a majority of journalists are Democrats. They say that they are. They say they vote Republican or they vote Democrat, and that some like 90% of their donations to parties go to the Democrat Party. So we know all of that. The question is, but almost all of them say, but I'm objective in my reporting. I don't let it show. Is that even possible?
I don't think that it's possible, but I think they make a good effort at it. When, one thing you mentioned about going directly to the source, going directly to the tweet or the blog, you're looking at people that actually make no attempt to back up anything they say with facts. I mean, I'm still very upset about Obama's Saturday morning tweet, and then we're told that
you mean Trump?
Trump's Saturday morning tweet, and he won't tell us what his what it is. Now they've kind of linked it to a Breitbart report, but he makes things up, and then the excuse that we get is don't take him literally. He is still learning. I'm sorry. He is the president of the United States, and when he says something, it needs to be taken seriously, and it needs to be taken literally, as do foreign powers who look at that, our allies look at that. And I'm sorry, but I didn't think of the presidency as an on-the-job training type of thing. To elect someone that's as inexperienced as him and say, well, he can do it, well, then he better be able to do the job.
Patty, do you mind if I jump in here a second?
Sure.
Okay, and we talked just a little bit ago about something getting reported where the reporter evidently did not verify the facts, such as the bust coming out of the Oval. They didn't follow up, check with different sources, maybe get somebody on site to verify that fact. It was just verified. So in many cases, is it possible that the press has not done their due diligence and verified their facts before they publish it? And so now that responsibility has been abdicated by the press, and just like somebody that's buying something direct from the manufacturer, I do not have a wholesaler or a retailer that has checked it out and said this is a quality product and will do this type of thing. That responsibility now falls to us. If we get direct news from somebody in the political arena, the press has not been between us and that news and has not verified it and said, we checked this out. This is true or not true. And so now it falls to us.
And I agree
Now
with
it
that,
falls to
except there's a
us.
big difference between the President of the United States
I'm not arguing that
reporting
point, Patty.
and stating that the former President of the United States committed a felony for which he could be imprisoned without giving any facts, and then when being told he was wrong, refusing to back down, and still to this day saying that it's true. It was like for the 8 years that he said that Obama was born in Kenya. At least that reporter was wrong, never should have said it. But the impact of that statement and the impact of the statements that we're seeing from this president, I think there's a big difference. I'm not excusing that man for making that mistake.
Okay.
And it was,
I know that.
And I'm sure there was the intention to make Trump appear racist. I don't think he just reported that out of, oh, isn't this an interesting little fact?
One of the things that I think that I look at is I would hold, and I don't disagree with Patty. I mean, someone needs to take away Mr. Trump's phone. He doesn't need to be on Twitter. But when you have a reporter who has been to one of the best journalism schools, they go to Columbia, they get advanced degrees in journalism, I believe they should be held to a higher standard. Okay, when it comes to reporting, they should be held to a higher standard. One case in point was the New York Times ran a story, it wasn't that long ago, about a young lady who was Muslim. She reported that she was beat up on a subway, and her face was beat up. And the reporter, they ran with that story immediately, and it came out that it was fake. So what did that do at that moment? Now, if you go online and I liked, there's a lot of different things, but Denzel Washington had a little YouTube piece, and he was being interviewed by some reporters, and he basically said, in your rush to get the story, you have basically, abdicated, and that was my own term, any notion of checking your sources, checking out the facts, and actually making sure that it's right.
And every time that happens, the credibility of the media goes down even farther.
Exactly.
That's
and
true.
it's at what, about 30% now, something like that?
It depends on the poll. I've seen anywhere from 45 to 30 something.
But what is the consequences of the reporting something that's not true? There really isn't any. Ever since Westmoreland versus 60 Minutes, or Mike Wallace, whichever it was, and the result was that the plaintiff has to prove that there was an intentional malice on the part of the reporter. He can print any lie he wants, but the plaintiff has to be able to prove this person printed that lie just to harm me because he doesn't like me for some reason. Now that is not a very high bar. And so I think that ever since Westmoreland versus Mike Wallace, that the media has felt free to say just about anything they want, as long as they can show it was without malice. And that's the part that's troublesome to me, and the fact that apparently, even the very, very low credibility ratings doesn't do much to change their behavior.
Just a couple comments, John. I think everybody involved, whether it's the people that are being reported upon and the people that are reading the reports, I do not know where we all learned to read other people's minds and know what their motives are. But many times we act that way. and
Yes.
you know, well, he wrote this because or whatever, but you're going to report you can read a report of a particular situation. One report says this, and one report says this,
Yeah.
and most people are going to believe what they want to believe.
Yeah, that's true. You,
Yeah.
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 They're going to believe what they want to
Whatever
believe.
your
Yep.
ideology is, you
It
listen
really
to those
is.
news
So,
reports, you believe the one that
yeah,
corresponds
and the
to yours.
one could be, and the one that's not.
I'm guilty of that.
You're
yeah.
going to say,
Oh, really?
that's not.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway.
As I sit here, the liberal between.
But I think, you know, so
Yeah.
maybe in some dysfunctional way, the press is serving its purpose to keep their purpose is to keep these guys on the straight and narrow, to keep our leaders to expose stuff that they're doing or not doing or whatever. So maybe in some
That's what
crazy
George-
way it's happening.
George W. Bush just stated that. It was interesting. I saw him do an interview, and he stayed out of politics
Yes.
Yeah,
completely.
right.
And he just came out this weekend and made the comment that he hated the press, but he said they're absolutely necessary
Right.
Yeah.
Oh,
to
absolutely.
keep us accountable.
Just one more point along that line. When President Trump was criticizing the media for printing things that were false or slanted or whatever, then people came out accusing him of wanting to eliminate the media or eliminate the First Amendment. People intentionally
Hyperbole.
they do. They don't know the difference between illegal immigration and immigration, or the difference between healthcare and healthcare insurance. They obviously just simply don't know. Mm-hmm. Well, that about wraps it up for us. Does anybody know who Jonas Kaplan is? Okay, I didn't think so. Jonas Kaplan is an assistant professor at UCLA, and he's doing a study on how the brain responds to receiving false information. And I love this quote from him. He said, every collaboration, whether in the solitude of a marriage or in a formal alliance between nations, requires that beliefs of those involved remain open to mutual influence through conversation. Open to mutual influence through conversation. Good night and good luck.